Sabine Hossenfelder made a video called Capitalism is Good, Let Me Explain. That's an appropriately defensive attitude to take with a title like that. Hold on now. Put your pitchforks down. Now is not a good time to be pro-capitalism in terms of, like, the public discourse, you know? Yeah, you guys remember her? I remember her. It seems like she gets in trouble whenever she talks about a subject that isn't science.
Capitalism will kill us all. That is, if you trust Greta Thunberg, which maybe you should not. Free markets will save us all, if you trust Robert F. Kennedy Jr., which maybe you should not. Maybe we should talk about what capitalism and free markets are. Will they kill us or save us? That's what we'll talk about today. Before we talk about capitalism and markets and stuff, we need to talk about money. I don't mean my money, though while we're at it, check out my Patreon. I mean money in general. What do we even need money for? Suppose you have an apple, but you'd rather have an egg. You ask your friend Sue, the one with the chickens, and trade an egg for an apple. Okay, but what if Sue doesn't want an apple? She'd rather have a banana. No problem. You ask your friend Joe with the bananas if he will trade your apple for a banana. Then you trade the banana for Sue's egg. Okay, but what if Joe doesn't want an apple either?
Okay, great. Okay, yeah, we're going to do the whole, like, bartering system. Okay, so so here's an important thing to distinguish, okay? A very, very, very important thing to distinguish, all right? When leftists, at least the smart ones, talk about, like, decommodification and the abolition of capital, it's very important to understand that capital and money are two different things. A currency can take many forms, you know? Like Chuck E. Cheese tokens are a form of currency. Capital is significant because it is a currency that can be reinvested into the acquisition and development of the means of production. This is one of the reasons why labor vouchers aren't the same as our current understanding of money. The idea of a labor voucher would be, yes, you do receive essentially money for work that you do. That is true. But the type of money that it is cannot be used to, say, buy a factory or to, you know, become a member of the bourgeoisie or to, you know, buy land. So, like, right off the bat, it's very important to distinguish between capital and, like, money broadly. Capital is a relatively recent concept. Well, it's existed in some forms for a long time, but its ubiquitousness is a fairly recent conception. Capital is the flow or circulation of money. Yeah, but it's flow or circulation within a broader market that allows for that sort of thing, you know? You couldn't really say that, like, Chuck E. Cheese tokens are capital, even though they do flow and circulate, because they can't be reinvested into anything outside of, I don't know, pizza? What do you get? I don't know.
He'd rather have new shoelaces. No problem. You ask your friend Mary if she'll take an apple for shoelaces. Give the shoelaces to Joe, take the banana, give the banana to Sue, and sure enough, you have your egg. It works, but honestly, that seems a little cumbersome. How about we instead trade something that everyone would accept, because they can exchange it for something else later?
Yeah, I've heard the idea that markets started with barter has been, like, highly contentious. I think there's been some research indicating that going back, like, really early in human civilization, or even pre-civilization, we have evidence that, like, I don't know what they were using, animal teeth? Were they all, like, 40K orcs or whatever? Like, I think, currency as a concept is a fairly obvious and straightforward invention that's probably been around for pretty long. Bartering never existed. I think that when a lot of people think of bartering, what they think of is haggling. Like, the idea of going to a market and, like, arguing down the price of a watermelon or something. You know, the idea of prices being a lot more fluid and something that you could sort of debate or argue around or whatever, that's probably more common early on than it is now. I assume so, at least. But yeah, I guess it varies. Okay, guys, I'm not an anthropologist. Let's not get too in the weeds here. I want to focus on stuff that I do know.
Like gold, maybe. I give some gold to Sue and she gives me an egg. Then she can take the gold and give it to Joe and get her a banana. That's much easier. Hooray, we just...
Can you imagine how f***ed up trading must have been back before like standard currencies existed, like with gold or whatever. Like that's why the whole biting a coin thing is a thing, because gold is a soft metal. So if it's like real gold and not something else that's been like painted gold or whatever, it'll bend in with your bite, you know? But like, can you imagine back then trying to like haggle stuff? Like everything could be bad. Like, oh, you're like trying to sell your cows or whatever. Well, the cows could be sick. This like wealth. Well, actually, the gold is like not 24 karat, but like 12 karat or whatever.
Just invented commodity money. All right, but
that's what scales were for, dude. You imagine something like weighing down the scales. Yeah, I feel like you could do literally anything back then. I feel like if you were a Saul Goodman huckster type, you could just go from town to town and just have like a billion tricks for trying to like strip people of their money all the time. Yeah, and people did. Yeah, people did. Yeah, of course, if they ever caught you doing that, they would hang you or just cut you down in the street.
Now imagine you don't want to buy an egg, but an entire chicken farm. That would be a lot of gold you'd have to wheel around. So how about we instead, I don't know, print the face of a king onto a piece of gold and say it stands for an entire cart of gold? Come to think of it, why bother with gold? Let's just print it on a piece of paper.
Gold is already pretty valuable. I don't know if people... I could be totally wrong on this, but I don't think that printing the face on the gold was meant to make the gold represent more gold than the gold was. Otherwise, it wouldn't be the gold standard. I think the point was to denote national currency. Or not national currency, but like kingdoms. And that way they could have certain standards, and like the fact that it was printed would have been a way of determining its authenticity. Like, if you had a coin printed in a specific way, it would be an indication that it was authentic with... Okay. Yeah, guarantee of weight and purity, yeah. It lets you track the currency to know where it was minted. Okay, whatever.
The paper itself doesn't have much of a...
Whoa, we just skipped a lot of time. Hold on. Oh my god. We just rocketed forward.
Value. But if we all agree on what it stands for, we can use it for trade. Hooray, we just invented token money. That sounds great.
Fiat currency? But paper dollars... Well, not necessarily fiat, because paper currency can still be backed by the gold standard. Okay, whatever.
But the problem is, if a lot of vendors just refuse to accept the money, it stops working. Fiat. So in reality, token money is backed up by a king or a government, which enforces that vendors accept the money as payment. It's then called fiat money.
Okay. So that was my mistake, not hers.
Almost all money we use today is fiat money, except cryptocurrencies. But that's another story. Fiat money is fascinating because it's ultimately still based on trust. If all you guys watching this video freak out, exchange your entire US dollars for euro, and tell your friends to do the same, the US dollar would collapse. So don't.
How many friends do you guys have? Oh my god. Yes, Nixon was the one who broke us out of the gold standard, which is probably good. Like, the idea of gold being the backer for your economy makes sense when you're all, like, primitive kingdoms that are, like, literally, how do we make our kingdom wealthier? Well, we ransack the other castle and get their gold. Like, okay, yeah, it's like literally, like, grug shit, you know? But the economy is a little more complicated now.
Do it. Several economists have argued that any community of sufficiently intelligent traders will eventually introduce a type of token money because it's the most efficient way to distribute resources.
That's probably true, unless there was a situation in which a small, transportable, divisible item had some innate utility, I think.
This idea was maybe first clearly formulated by the Scottish economist Adam Smith. All right, so we have money, but our busy traders still have a problem. Suppose you have a lot of apples and not sufficiently many people to buy them.
We are really leading into this, by the way. We're like doing a whole kind of wrong Anthropology 101 before even getting to the capitalism bit.
Your amazing apples rot away. What a shame. You would like to make apple juice from them, but you can't afford a juice press, so your breakthrough innovation doesn't come into being. That sucks. However, your friend Sue has been getting really rich with all her chickens. So rich, in fact, she's sitting on a big pile of money that she doesn't know what to do with. Sue sees your problem and offers you a deal. She gives you some of her money so that you can buy your juice press. You just have to agree that if you get rich with your juice press, you give her the money back, plus something on top. That money which Sue gives to you is your capital. And such was born the capitalist. The capitalist is a person or institution who provides capital to those who want to launch a new business.
No, that would be an investor. Capitalism is a whole economic system, and capital, well, the money that was provided in that investment would be capital, yes, but that's not how, okay.
Someone who's able and willing to take the risk that this capital will never have a return on investment.
No? Oh, God, the ideology right off the bat. A capitalist is someone willing to take the risk? No. Again, you're thinking of an investor, and there are plenty of other professions that are more risky than being an investor, such as in the 1800s, all professions. It's the idea that, like, the investor is the only one who takes the risk, and not say, like, everyone involved in the economy, like people can lose their jobs or get downsized or whatever, like is capitalist realism 101. Also, capitalists hate risk. Look at, like, the shit Marvel produces. Like, it's the moment they have a formula down.
Today we grow up with money and banks and all that, and we tend to take them for granted. And while money lending and a basic notion of financial debt date back thousands of years, capitalism and all the elaborate financial instruments that come with it is a surprisingly recent innovation. It didn't really take off until the Industrial Revolution 150 years ago, and it's dramatic.
It's also worth knowing that, like all other gigantic economic or political paradigms, there's no hard line where you cross into capitalism. Much in the same way that, like, America isn't a perfect free market because, like, the post office is run by the government or whatever. Like, there's no, like, single point where something becomes another thing. Much in the same way that, like, you know, democracy existed in some form back in Athens, or you could argue, like, you know, the monarchy exists today in the form of, like, the European nobility, like the royal families. But it's not like the UK is like a monarchy. Like, if you describe, oh, what's the UK? Oh, it's a monarchy. Well, no, it's a parliamentary democracy that has a monarchy, you know. It's much the same with capitalism, you know. Capitalism, is, at least in the Marxian sense, is mostly about the class distinction. It's mostly about the relationship between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, as distinguished from the feudal relationship between lord and serf, you know? And that was like a kind of like a procedural thing. Like, or like it took a while to shift over.
Dramatically changed the world. Scientists tend to associate the stunning societal progress we've seen since then to science and technology. But I think that's having it backwards. The driver of all this progress was the capitalist system that allowed an efficient allocation of resources. By resources...
There's so much wrong with this. The reason technology exploded the way that it did was because of the Industrial Revolution. A huge part of how advanced a society is really just comes down to how much energy there is. Once we started putting steam engines everywhere, our ability to make new shit exponentially increased. That would probably still have happened even if we were still locked in a feudal state of affairs. I mean, like, for example, you could actually see this transition happening pretty clearly in England, one of the earliest countries in the world to have an industrial revolution, and at the time, while they did have a parliament, it was a monarchy where the monarch had real power, and what's more, like, they had, like, a kind of, like, lord-serf relationship going on over there, though it was more complicated. English history is so complicated, it's such an old country. But what you saw, essentially, is that the mode shift from feudalism to capitalism was described primarily by who had the wealth and who had the resources to use the labor of the proletariat. Whereas the lords used the pretext of their land ownership, the capitalists used the pretext of their factory ownership. And the nature of the relationship changed. Because lords owned large swaths of land that the serfs lived on, the relationship there was one of the farmer. You live on the land and you provide a portion of what you raise to the lord, and that's the deal. Whereas with the capitalist, you don't have a bunch of people living in factories, but you know, you have people living around factories. So rather than people living on the land, you have people visit the land or the factory for a portion of their day, back then like 12 to 14 hours a day, because life sucked back then. And factories are a much more efficient way of producing things than farms are, and they can use resources produced by farms like cotton or linen in order to produce new things that are more expensive. And then the capitalist who owns those things, because of law, because of bad laws, can sell those things for enormous profits. The argument that Marx makes is that the fundamental relationship is not changing here. That you have the feudal lord and the serf, and you have the capitalist and the worker. But fundamentally, the basic dynamic is about the same. You use different laws, different legal pretexts, and different arrangements, but the goal is always the same: to find a way to legitimize the exploitation of the labor of the proletariat. Does that make sense to everyone? So to be clear, I'm not arguing that capitalism was not concurrent with this shift. I would say that the material circumstances dictated by the Industrial Revolution, caused by the Industrial Revolution, incentivize capital development, largely because of the growth of cities. And you can't really do the whole, like, lord owning serfs thing in a city because cities don't have farms. I mean, not really, you know. So you have to find other modes of re-engaging in the relationship between the the owner and the worker. Would you be able to call capitalism a sort of neo-feudalism then? Well, I would argue all economic systems are the same basic dynamic. I would say that the closest thing we could get to neo-feudalism would be like libertarianism or anarcho-capitalism, because that seeks to do away with the protective framework of the state and bring things back to a simpler form where you are a corporation's bitch and that's that. You know, I would say that's like a regression towards an earlier political and economic mode.
I don't just mean raw materials, but also goods and human resources. Capitalism is a system that distributes these resources without anyone needing to have an overview.
Excuse me? What? Wait, is this like actual invisible hand of the free market? Like there are no choices made in the distribution of resources? There are no like material failures or like it's just all okay. If she's arguing that basic supply and demand laws dictated material distribution to the point that there was no human involvement in it, supply and demand has been a thing for thousands of years. That is not a capitalist thing. That's just a law of economics. Like, supply demand raising or lowering the price of goods was a thing back in like the Assyrian Empire or what. Like, that's not new. That's an uncharitable interpretation of what she's saying. I don't know. I don't know. I'm sorry. Without human no. Nah.
Just by interactions between traders. It's
yeah, see, she's just describing economics here, not capitalism.
Pure genius if you think about it.
This is just
and that's why science took off, not the other way around.
No.
Remember that story about how the Scottish physician Alexander Fleming supposedly accidentally discovered penicillin in 1928 and saved the lives of countless wounded soldiers in World War II?
That's great.
Yeah, well, that isn't really what happened.
Oh.
First of all, scientists had discovered that the fungus penicillium inhibits the growth of bacteria decades earlier.
This is another element of capitalist realism, the idea that basic concepts of trade. You remember how like it's like the whole currency thing has existed forever? Like but we weren't all bartering up until like the 1700s. It's like that, you know? So like it's like, oh, capitalism has created everything. It's created supply and demand. It's created like currency. It's like, well, no.
It just wasn't widely known. The British psychologist Burton Sanderson, for example, observed this in 1870 and wrote a book about it. There are also several other written documentations from other people around that time who had studied the effects of fungi on bacteria. Fleming's contribution was that he realized the fungus was shedding a particular substance, which he called penicillin. But he pretty much left it at naming the stuff. It wasn't until 10 years later that a group at the University of Oxford set out to find a way to grow the fungus and extract penicillin in large quantities. They then conducted medical trials, and once they were sure penicillin was both safe and effective, their method was scaled up by the pharmaceutical industry. Two members of the...
Okay, so what of this are we going to attribute to capitalism? Because university researchers doing medical experiments has been around for as long as universities have and as long as medicine has. And then having a project be funded has been around for longer than the modern concept of medicine or science. You guys do know that, like, you could go back to, like 1200 BC in China, and there were absolutely people petitioning the glorious emperor for, like, money in order to finance their cool, like, paper kites or whatever. Like, yeah, like, this has always been a thing. So, like, where are we going to say it's capitalism?
The Oxford group later shared the Nobel Prize with Fleming. So what saved all those many lives wasn't just Fleming's observation in a petri dish. The game changer was producing the stuff in large quantities.
Wow, dog. No, holy shit, dude. I can't. Well, really? You're telling me that in order for medicine to be used and distributed widely to World War II soldiers, they had to find a way to widely produce and distribute? Dude, oh my god, that's crazy. And only capitalism could have produced something en masse, right? Like, that's the only system that before capitalism, nobody had invented the concept of big numbers. But with capitalism now, they were able to invent big numbers. You see, prior to capitalism, people were just counting on their hands, man. You know, you could go up to 10. Mr. King, I have 10 medicine. I would argue that the collaboration of scientific ingenuity and mass production has been miraculous for humanity. That this has nothing to do with the relationship between the worker and the owner.
And bringing it where it was needed. Innovation and industrialization ultimately going back to capitalism.
No. How can you attribute the innovation when you just said it was university researchers? How can you attribute the innovation there? You said the innovation was being done by university researchers. How can you possibly... Oxford was founded like 1,000 years ago. It's not public, but it's certainly not a mode of, like, modern capitalist production. Yeah, 1096. I can't believe... Yeah, older than the Aztec Empire. I can't believe that they did capitalism early here. Yeah, sorry, I was going to say public when what I meant to say was, like, not a product of capitalism. Yeah, universities are publicly funded. I assume Oxford gets some kind of public funds. I'm not sure, but it doesn't really matter because it's clearly not capitalism.
That's what saved all those people. Capitalism got a pretty bad rep when Marx claimed...
Yeah, that's true, man. When all those people were working 14-hour days, sending their children to coal mines and dying of black lung, everyone was totally fine with capitalism until this one guy, you know, he was this real rabble-rouser, you know? Guys, I wonder why, like, radical socialist militancy took root in basically everywhere in the world all at once. It must have been because everyone was fine with capitalism before him, you know?
Claimed that it's just about grabbing hold of the means of production and exploiting the working class.
What? Capitalism isn't about grabbing hold of the means of production. A proletarian revolution is about... Wait. We're conflating ideas here. No, the bourgeoisie do not grab hold of the means of production because grabbing hold of it would imply that it wasn't created to their benefit. They are the means of production. That's how you define... Bourgeoisie is when you have the means of production. You don't grab hold of it. You are it. They just have it. It is about labor exploitation, though.
Of course, there was an element of truth to his fears, because some things went badly wrong during the Industrial Revolution.
Just some things. Nothing systemic, though. Nothing fundamental. There was no, like, broader lesson to be learned. It was just, like, some mistakes that happened a little bit. I feel like it's important to remind ourselves, in 1833, the Factory Act banned children under 9 from working in the textile industry, and the working hours of 10 to 13-year-olds were limited to 48 hours a week, while 14 to 18-year-olds were limited to 69 hours a week and 12 hours a day. Nice. Socialism prevails. I mean, I'm sure we've seen photos of Victorian England, like factories and textile mills. You know, the grinders where children would lose their hands and shit, because their hands were smaller, so they were used to, like, unstick jams in the weaving, that kind of stuff. Oh, do you guys want to see something wild? Wait, hold on. Oh, here we go. Cheap Victorian doss house. Yeah, people were crammed together so tightly so that they couldn't sleep, like, on beds. So what they would do was have a bench with a rope pulled taut in front of it, and they would just sleep against the rope in between their, like, shifts. Yeah, here we go. Oh, they didn't even have a bench. They're just dead. It's called a 2-penny hangover. That's the term for this. I just think it's very important to remember. Keep in mind that, like, the quality of life for a lot of these people was significantly worse than it was under feudalism. Under feudalism, being a serf under a lord is not a good deal, don't get me wrong. But as wealth dried up in the countryside and people had to move into cities to find jobs, like, you don't sleep like this as a serf. You know, these are very different conditions. It's crazy that these people lived like the worst lives imaginable and they still got up every day and put a suit on. That is crazy. Ah, here we go. I wish I'd found this earlier. Not uncommon for workers to be expected to work shifts of 16 hours a day in grueling conditions. Lack of breaks during the long shifts. Often workers were denied their breaks or were deducted pay for taking a break. As well, they were sometimes required to clean the machines during their meals. There are factories, no means few in number nor confined to the smaller mills, in which serious accidents are continually occurring and in which, notwithstanding dangerous parts of the machinery are allowed to remain unfenced. The situation caused industrial workers to become injured as they were working dangerously close to spinning belts and shafts that powered all the machines. Any loose-fitting clothing could easily become clogged and pull the worker violently into the workings of the machine. Furthermore, the factories of the Industrial Revolution were known for excruciating heat. They were cramped in confined spaces. They were built without windows or proper ventilation. The temperature in the inside of the factory would increase dramatically. Yeah, so it's not great. Now, keep in mind that everything we're describing here was being created by the fact that the decisions were being made by the bourgeoisie and not by the working class. If the workers collectively controlled any one of these factories, they would not have 16-hour days. They would not build them without windows. They would not force people to clean machines during their break. There would be no reason for them to. It would be literally against their interest to do so. And they would make plenty more money without all the wealth being siphoned by the robber baron on top. Don't mistake industrial progress for capitalism. Industrial progress is in many cases good.
But that's another story. For today, we just need to know that capitalism, like fiat money, requires a governing institution. That's because someone must be there to enforce contracts should the need arise.
This is true. Libertarians don't get this part. Well, literally all economic systems require a government. Everything requires a government. Outside of like anarcho-primitivism, I guess. But yeah.
That and a few other things, as we'll see in a moment. There are many different ways to govern a capitalist system, and they go by different names like welfare capitalism, or laissez-faire capitalism, or state capitalism. Now, one can debate how well the actions of certain governments reflect the interests of their electorate, if they were elected.
These terms mean very different things
in the first place, but that's another story. Even so, capitalism has been enormously successful in unlocking societal progress. And the nations who still don't use it, such as North Korea, Cuba, and Laos, are places you don't want to live.
Cuba's fine? Like, it's not great, but considering the sanctions that have been placed on them and all the hardship, they've actually done remarkably well. Like, North Korea's problems... Wait, does she think the problem with North Korea is that they're not capitalist? Like, I would argue they're state capitalist, but don't mind me. Would you, like that's what's going on over there? Like, they just haven't done capitalism? Are we to argue, like, is Turkmenistan not capital? Like, yeah. Just, like, again, capitalist realism. Attribute literally all human good to capitalism.
We've seen that capitalism is a system that combines markets with governing rules to efficiently distribute resources.
No! Markets and rules have both existed for as long as human civilization have existed. Law and markets are pre-civilization things. Even tribes had markets and laws, though they wouldn't have called them laws. They would have just said rules, but you've called them rules.
This distribution of resources works best if everyone can put forward their offers freely and customers can pick what they want. This is known as a free market, and it optimizes the distribution of resources.
Jesus Christ.
By competition. Free markets are a beautiful example of decentralized self-organization, an invisible hand as...
Oh my... Bro, whoa. I figured she would just be a liberal. This is like actual unironic, like high school me level misunderstanding of libertarianism. Holy shit. Jesus Christ.
Adam Smith put it. The way it works in a nutshell is that everyone can trade around until they've got what they think is the best combination of goods, services, and financial assets. If someone doesn't use resources as efficiently as
everyone has always been able to do this. As long as trade has existed, you had what you had, and you could try to use it to trade for the best things you can. That's not new.
possible, some competitor can do it better and beat them off the market. This idea also goes back to Adam Smith, but later blossomed into an entire discipline now known as microeconomics. Microeconomics is all about how agents, that could be people or corporations or institutions.
The funny thing is that Adam Smith wasn't even a full capitalist. He opposed monopolies. Yeah, if you actually read Adam Smith, he was very, like, anti-landlord. He was anti-monopoly. All sensible advocates for capitalism understand that the free market invisible hand dogma is complete bullshit. Like, in order to understand economics, you have to know that it's bullshit. It's only like, it's only people who are superficially interested and largely, like, ignorant of how this stuff works that would use terms like this. You know, it's not, yes, Adam Smith would despise the current American economy. Adam Smith wasn't that bad of a guy. Like, obviously I disagree with some of the stuff he said, but like, he was like a very smart and, you know, considerate guy, I'm sure. A lot of people back in those days thought capitalism would legitimately be like the liberating force of mankind because they had detached monetary possessions and ownership from nobility and like the landed aristocracy. It was like an anti-monarchical attitude of economic accumulation, you know, because you're no longer tied to like, you know, mercantilism.
Trade and how that trade distributes resources where they are most needed. To be fair, microeconomics has some shortcomings when it comes to explaining how we trade in reality, but that's another story. But
this economic field is good. It has some shortcomings though when interacting with reality.
By and large, microeconomics works fine, and several Nobel Prizes have been awarded for it. One of the most important insights to come out of this research area is that free markets only work to everyone's benefit if they're set up properly. Keep in mind that capitalism isn't
that would be not a free then what do we mean by free market?
Just a free market. It's a free market plus the governing framework to run it.
If you want a really good example of how this is bullshit, read up on the it's called the South Asian tigers, right? Read up on like the economic growth seen in like South Korea, Singapore, like countries like that, and countries that, yeah, the East Asian tigers that engaged in like significant protectionism as a way of preserving their economy from Western business exploitation until they were strong enough to compete on their own terms, you know? And then look at Russian shock therapy, yeah. then look at what happens when you take a country and open it up suddenly to a Western free market and see how well that goes.
Free markets do not, for example, work to everyone's favor if some people have insider information, which gives them a trading advantage. This is why we have laws against that. Free markets also work badly if one single company dominates a market sector and can use their power to force customers to stick with them.
There's a smaller dude down there my cam is blocking. I don't care to move it.
This is why we have laws against that. And
yeah, that worked great, by the way. We definitely don't have a problem with monopolies right now, by the way. By the way, she's arguing against the concept of a free market. I don't like the idea of people considering themselves advocates for a free market, and they're like, okay, but here are all the government rules. The whole point of a free market is that you're not supposed to have these rules. If you want to argue for, like, a non-free market, then go for it, fine. But I don't like the conflation.
Free markets also don't automatically account for externalities, such as environmental pollution. An externality is generally any consequence of trade that doesn't directly affect the trading parties. They can be both good and bad, but it's the bad ones that are the problem. Suppose there's
now, hypothetically, and follow through with me here on this weird example. What if, in a system where the businesses are owned by wealthy people who made that wealth from their businesses, they use that wealth to buy and control media and lobby politicians to make them sympathetic to their interests? Then you have a situation where even though coal and oil executives represent an infinitesimally small fraction of the American population, hypothetically, they would have a ridiculously outsized influence on U.S. policy, up to and including outright threatening to not build new facilities or shut down existing facilities in states that contain senators or congresspeople who won't vote for them or vote for their interests. Just hypothetically, What if we've set up a system where we're supposed to put rules on these people, but they're the ones with the power to make the rules? Interesting hypothetical. Yeah, I wonder if some... Yeah, sorry. Interesting hypothetical.
There's a river going by your house that everyone is free to use. One day a clothing company puts up a factory and dumps their toxic waste into the river. Or the fish die and no one dares swimming in the river anymore. This is clearly not an optimal use of resources, you might say. Why didn't Smith's invisible hand prevent it? The reason market forces didn't prevent it is that the water was free to use. The market didn't know it had any value, so pollution couldn't reduce its value.
What? The water had value, but the factory polluting in it saw the river's value as a dumping site. What is that? What? Are you suggesting the solution to river pollution is to like charge river water by the gallon? What are you suggesting? You can't fix pollution, but people you can charge for river water when it's entered into when it's bottled or when it's entered into our water mains. What do you mean? What does that even mean? You could fix the pollution by making the water cost money? It wouldn't matter to the polluters. They're not selling water. They're selling whatever their factory is making waste producing. What does this mean? If only somebody had told the Trump administration that water costs money, and none of this would have happened. Sadly, at some point during the Trump administration, somebody made the rivers not cost money. I think she's talking about charging the companies themselves for water, so polluting it would increase the cost. But they're not using the water, they're dumping in it. So you wouldn't be charging them for water use. They're just dumping in the river. Is the implication here that we could solve this problem by just charging companies more to pollute our rivers? Like that would fix it? I think she means the market forces that led to the construction of the factory weren't affected by water pollution. I think it's a piss poor acknowledgement of problems with the free hand idea. I mean, I agree with the concept of an externality. I understand that, but I don't understand the framework with which this is being approached. Whatever.
There are several ways to deal with problems like this. One is to just pass laws that forbid certain actions and punish those who disobey.
Wow, wouldn't that be cool? Awesome. Wait, cool. We did it in one. Hell yeah. If you're a company and you run a factory and the factory dumps in the river, yeah, you should go to jail for a really long time. I agree, yeah. That's not something you can do by accident. Whenever you hear about a factory polluting a river, people think like, oh, it's one toxic barrel. It's usually like thousands of gallons of waste.
Or you can put a tax on the pollution so that at least...
No. Do not let corporations kill the environment, like, on a dime. Like, oh, sorry, your family built near this river and it's been a part of your family for generations and it's beautiful and every day you wake up to the sunrise glistening over the river's edge and now it's all waste and polluted and smells like shit and there's plastic bubbling to the surface. Don't worry, okay? We've charged the corporation a little bit more money.
At least the government has money to clear up the mess. Or...
Government clear up the mess. Yeah, sure. Also, why would the government clear up the mess if it's not a crime? If you're just like putting a fine on pollution, why would... Is it like a tax or a fine? Like, are we cleaning it? Shouldn't they clean it?
You can put a price on using the water. There are pros and cons to all of those, but that's a different story.
No, just arrest them. Just arrest them. Throw them in jail forever. Just arrest them.
The story for today is that we have known that externalities can lead to market failures since the middle of the last century.
We've always known this. Also, not just externalities, internalities also lead to market failures. It doesn't have to be an externality.
Carbon dioxide emissions are...
A good example of an internality, I don't know if that's even a real term, a non-externality affecting or creating a market condition or a market failure would be planned obsolescence. You know how Apple got in trouble because every time they released a new iPhone, all of your previous iPhones bricked all of a sudden magically for no reason at all? Hey, better buy the new iPhone to get it new, you know? Like, that is an example of there being an internal cost-accounted incentive to make worse products in order to make more money.
Are such an externality. For the market to optimize the use of fossil fuel resources, we should have put a price on releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere.
No, stop. The carbon tax didn't work. Stop, no.
We did not. And that's why we're now in deep shit. So
no, we do. We have that. It doesn't work. Carbon taxes absolutely work. What? No, they don't. Because, well, first of all, because they trade their carbon cap around, and which is its own thing. But secondly, like the carbon tax will never be set high enough that it will meaningfully disincentivize this behavior in the time frame necessary. The problem is these rules are being made by people who are ultimately in the corporation's pocket. So if the punishment is just like a fine, like it's not enough. The carbon tax has always just been a way of hand waving it and like throwing the problem to the free market. Oh, the planet may be dying, and this may have been the hottest year ever in human history, and the ice may not be remelting in Antarctica, and also, like, there might be 50 times as many tropical storms before, but don't worry, you know, it is economically incentivized for them to not pollute as much. But then they all trade their carbon credits around. I'm sorry, I really hate the carbon tax. Yeah, it's just the cost of doing business. It's just the cost of doing business.
Yes, our current capitalist systems do have a problem with environmental protection, but the reason isn't that there's something wrong.
I disagree, of course.
With capitalism per se. It's that we didn't set it up correctly in the first place.
Yep. Capitalism can never fail you. We can only fail capitalism. There's nothing wrong with capitalism as a system. It's just us, the pathetic, weak, lowly humans, just gasping and shielding our eyes from the glory and benevolence of the system known as capitalism. We failed to set it up properly. She's speaking like an adherent to religious dogma. Yeah, I hate this shit. I hate this shit. Isn't this their critique of socialism? You could do this with, like, any ideology. Like, basic step one shit. Have we not noticed that basically every problem that we've talked about thus far with regards to capitalism could be solved with worker democracy? Just not even to speak of decommodification. Isn't a lot of this stuff directly downstream of businesses and politicians being sympathetic to a very specific set of bourgeois interests, and that the 99% of the population that is the proletariat, despite being the ones who have to suffer the consequence of these changes and having far less money with which to do so, by the way, you know, have proportionally less influence? Pollution wouldn't be solved by worker democracy. I think it would be partially. I think that worker democracy would necessarily be more transparent and more humanistic. The thing that's important to remember about the coal and oil CEOs is that they're not human beings. They are demons. And demons don't care about polluting the environment. A democratically elected council of workers whose decisions are transparently broadcasted to a larger decentralized council of workers in the company would be both more transparent and more human. I genuinely believe this. And I think a good example of this would be the fact that worker cooperatives are more likely to have every worker take a pay cut than to fire someone. Even in situations where you could very easily have a majority of voters in a worker council economically benefit from ousting someone, even one who they don't really like that much, so they can save money, in many cases they don't. People will willingly take pay cuts so everyone can still get a slice of the pie. I think there's a lot of evidence to indicate that democracy in general just makes human behavior more human. And that, you know, much in the same way that feudal aristocracy made people more distant and alien, so too does bourgeois economic and political preference.
Place. Basically, the origin of the problem is that no one paid attention to economists. And unfortunately, we still don't pay enough attention to economists.
This is largely true. People on the left often argue that econ majors are all like Ayn Rand lovers. But in reality, it is true that economists have for a long time been screeching at politicians to not do the things they're doing. I'm not saying that economists are all socialists. They're not. But they tend to argue for, like, mathematically superior iterations of capitalism. Now, of course, if they were socialists, that would be even better, because good capitalism is still worse than good socialism. Yeah, it's like Keynesian economics, right? The idea of, like, let the government spend a shit ton of money to, like, stimulate the economy. Like, that's pretty popular in economics.
The current situation is that companies who voluntarily produce environmentally friendly goods put themselves at a competitive disadvantage because other companies exploit the environment at zero cost.
Do you want to know why economists aren't listened to? Because the small subset of economists that get broadcasted and supported by businesses are the ones that the businesses are monetarily incentivized to broadcast. Who could have guessed that the problems with our economy, the externalities, the market failures, all seem to be for the benefit of the bourgeoisie to the detriment of the system as a whole. And then for some reason, the economists who promote that mode of governance are the ones who end up getting like cabinet spots, you know? That's crazy.
This moves the burden onto the consumer. If you want to buy a climate-friendly product today, you face extra costs because fossil fuels are cheap and getting to net zero is not. This makes no economic sense, and it'll ultimately not work.
Why does it not make economic sense? A carbon-friendly product costs more to produce, so the cost is passed on to the consumer. That is literally capitalism. You're describing the logic of commodification. You're describing like what you're describing, like this doesn't make any sense because it would be socially beneficial to do another thing. Yeah, but that's a whole other thing. If you want socialism, say social. Like what are we talking about? That's economically rational.
It's completely upside down. Products whose production causes damage to the environment, which then requires adaptation and mitigation, should be more expensive, not less expensive. This is why economists have argued for decades that we need to put a price on carbon, and it's why several countries have now introduced carbon taxes or...
She's literally like reconciling with the fact that capitalism incentivizes bad behavior, and she's like, well, that's not right. Someone should fix that. And then there's this guy called Karl Marx who wrote about all this 150 years ago. Like literally, she's like, yeah, this doesn't make any sense. Why has nobody thought? Notice how she's not talking about like, hey, very, very wealthy, powerful, intelligent people control the decisions that go through our nation. Why are all of these countries just settling on this weird, irrational set of policy preferences that somehow benefit the bourgeoisie? She's not asking herself that because she, like a classic liberal, this is the liberal brain rot that I've talked about so many times, literally incapable of systemic thinking, not capable of it. Everything is individual. Everything is interpersonal. There's no like acknowledgement of why are all these really like ask why are all these inefficiencies happening? Like we were talking earlier about how capitalism is so smart and so wise and it works so well. So why are all these obviously socially detrimental behaviors being incentivized? Could it be that capitalism innately privileges and prioritizes the views and interests of a specific group of people with different interests to us?
Use a cap and trade system to calculate.
Yeah, cap and trade, super. Yeah, that's what we need. Hottest year in human history, by the way.
The cost of carbon emissions, one basically needs to evaluate the damage the emissions would cause in the future and then put a price on them. Mm-hmm. It's called the social cost of carbon. There's a long debate about just exactly how to calculate this, but that's another story. At the moment, carbon taxes and trading schemes only apply...
It's incredible. Like, I cannot believe I'm hearing a person unironically defend cap and trade. This is like a whole stream subject or whatever, but cap and trade is the most abused. Cap and trade is supposed to solve climate change, but oil and gas company emissions are up. Countries have called California's cap and trade program the answer to climate change, but it's just as vulnerable to lobbying as any other legislation. The result, the state's biggest oil and gas companies have actually polluted more since it started. And a lot of this is because, like, on the dollar, they trade off their right to, like, produce more carbon, and they end up doing more with it. Businesses are given a leeway for how much they can produce, and they can sell off the upper cap of theirs that they don't use and give the oil and coal companies, like, more leeway. There's one way to solve this, man. You set carbon limits, and when people break them, okay, you arrest them. Sorry.
To about a quarter of all emissions, and the price of carbon is almost certainly still too low, but it's a step in the right direction. In summary, capitalism has been incredibly successful in advancing society. To the extent that it has caused us problems, it's because we haven't properly used it.
Yep, again, capitalist realism, capitalism is God. Capitalism invented currency, capitalism invented trade, capitalism invented supply-demand, capitalism invented innovation, capitalism invented science. If things are bad, if the world is burning and income inequality is higher than ever before in all of human history, it's because we have failed capitalism. Capitalism was given to us by God, okay? We heard the sermon of God. We were given the 3 tablets, the 10 commandments, and like Adam Smith, and we're breaking it. We're not doing good.
The solution is not to abandon it, but to make sure it works to our advantage. There's no simple way to do that, and everyone who claims that the solution is to either discard capitalism or blindly trust it didn't understand the problem in the first place.
She is blindly trusting it. She literally made the argument for like free hand of the market.
Microeconomics and financial modeling is completely fascinating. It's basically the mathematics that rules the world. If you want to learn more about how it works, our sponsor Brilliant can help you.
Man, that was pretty bad. You know, credit where credit's due, at least to our audience. There are plenty of dislikes in this video, and I wouldn't necessarily believe that a science-oriented community would be like hardcore socialist or whatever, but if you look in the comments, Sabine responds to a comment talking about David Graeber and the trade barter economy by saying, quote, "I did not mean to make a historical statement. I'm very sorry if it came across that way. In fact, I did not look at the history at all." Wow, really? Well, at least she's open about it. I remember my economics professor saying most people think that the job of economists is to advise governments, when instead it's more common for governments to hire economists to justify their policies. I wonder if there's some kind of class incentive operating here, where the people in power have a different set of incentives from the average person. I wonder. Important part that's missing from this point of view is corporate lobbying of governments. We cannot talk about setting rules that will benefit majority if minority could just buy access to politicians. All the problems with capitalism arise out of, but that's just another story. Unfortunately, I do not have a capital, therefore I am what Sabine would call another story. This is one of the reasons why I've always been so loud about the fact that the first thing that you have to do to achieve socialism is you have to abolish the bourgeoisie as a class. You have to have a proletarian state. This is what older theorists called a dictatorship of the proletariat, because dictatorship had a different meaning 150 years ago. But basically, a huge number of problems that we face aren't down to like the nitty-gritty of economic distribution. It comes down to the fact that the people making all the decisions just have different interests than the vast majority of people. The goal then, market socialism, is a system in which, say, for the sake of example, you maintain all of the commodification of our economy. People still earn wages from their businesses. They use it to buy their clothing and their food. You know, there's stuff to be worked on here, certainly, but let's focus on one problem at a time. And I think the first problem we should concern ourselves with is who's making those decisions. Because how could we ever trust any kind of big economic shift forward if the decisions behind that shift are being controlled largely by a different economic class? Once the proletariat are in charge, once you have a proletariat state, it's a lot easier to make decisions, I feel, about how to decommodify, because you're no longer being controlled by a group of people with a completely different set of interests. How do we destroy the rich without upending our current society? You don't have to destroy anything, and I genuinely mean that. As much fun as it is for people online to talk about guillotines and this, that, the other, in reality, the abolition of the bourgeoisie as a class would be nothing more than a simple package of laws regarding wealth distribution and a mandate for collective ownership of any business one works in. This would be done incrementally. We would probably have a transitory period of several years where businesses of certain sizes would kind of be incrementally and gradually built up to certain levels of mandated democracy. We would have another government institution, much like OSHA, except rather than regulating workplace safety and making sure that everyone's properly securing their ladders, it would regulate workplace democracy, interviewing workers to make sure that everyone in every business feels that, you know, maybe it's not perfect, but they're meeting the bare minimum when it comes to economic democratization. Now, over time, we can increase that threshold, and I think that it will be easy to do so, because once you democratize partially, I think that there's kind of like a ball rolling towards full democratization, you know? In the same way that unions push into co-ops, and how American democracy, when America was founded, which was just rich landowning white men, snowballed into full democracy, except for like felons and children or whatever. You know, I think it would be easy to bring that about. I think that'd be an easy incentive structure to put forward. But anyway, it wouldn't require violence. I also think that capital flight is an overstated problem. You know? Make it so that offices in the United States, businesses, anyone who physically lives here has a mandated level of worker democracy. If they work for some kind of like international fit, you know, where like foreign companies use American workers, you'd have to have special exemptions. Maybe if a certain portion of your worker base is American, you would have to comply with the democratization, or you wouldn't be allowed to have employees from America. But if you only have like one or two contractors, maybe you could have exceptions where maybe those people don't get the democracy. It would be a process. But any change in this direction is good change. And I think you could do all of this without fundamentally disrupting the economy or supply lines, which is important because we want people to have food and penicillin. Has a system like that been implemented yet? There are societies that have had degrees of worker cooperatives. Tito's Yugoslavia. Funnily enough, Mussolini's Italy during a point, though with very different aims than what I'm going for. And also, worker democracies exist today in America, in much of Latin America. There's a thriving culture of them. You can point to them and look for examples and success stories. What if the government just took the means production for us? The government is beholden to capital interests. They won't do it on their own. Not without a very proletarian government. Apparently, South Korea is a huge farming cooperative. It's only a real cooperative if it's called a worker cooperative. Other kinds of cooperatives are not real. If you hear someone advertising, oh, they're a cooperative, it doesn't matter. If they're a worker cooperative, it matters. Thoughts on the Zapatistas? I respect their aims and their goals, but I feel like the obsession with them that some people demonstrate betrays an unwillingness to engage with the material reality of the American proletarian interest. No one in America, outside of a very small number of very online people, care about the Zapatistas. Even in Mexico, only a small number of people care about the Zapatistas. Probably far more people dislike them than like them for what they represent. I think that while there's many good things they push for and many good things that they stand for, and I'm sure many of them are fine people, I think that it's best to focus our conversations on the modes of change that are most effective in this society. And even in Mexico, the Zapatistas are not it. They're a holdout. You cannot replace everything with co-ops. Watch me. Why? Why not? Why can't every authoritarian business be made democratic? We can do it with every government. Now, if you have a business of like 2 men, like, okay, have the threshold be 10 people. Why not? 10 people. If you have more than 10 employees, you would have to abide by a set of rules concerning democratization. So then it's not a co-op. If it has like 2 people, then no. I'm not interested in there being a cooperative of 2 people. I don't think the government's energy is spent best on that particular matter. You're asking for populist, not co-op. A worker co-op is a business where the business is owned collectively by its workers. It also implies democratic control. It'd be pretty silly for it to be owned collectively but have no democratic control. That'd be kind of a silly mix of incentives. That's a co-op. Technically, you can have a worker democracy that is not a cooperative. A good example of this might be a government industry. A government industry cannot be let's say, for example, a branch of the post office. The branch of the post office, it can't be a worker cooperative because the workers cannot collectively own it. It's owned by the United States government, as it should be. It's decommodified. But you can still have a worker democracy. You would ideally, however, still want it to be a worker cooperative, because if it's not a worker cooperative, you might just have a little member of the bourgeoisie in there. Hey, bucko, if the workers don't own that business, who does? Yeah, there's zero reason as to why small companies couldn't also be cooperatives above a certain small number of employees. Doesn't Belgium mandate unions for companies over 20 employees? I don't really know, but that's good, though unions, of course, are different from workplace democracy. We could keep calling them corporations. They would still be corporations. A worker-controlled company or corporation is still a company or corporation. In order to make them not those things, you would have to decommodify, which is the next step towards socialism. And there's plenty of decommodification that needs to be done as well. Do you think the excess wealth from the exploitation helped us reach the standard of living? There is no excess wealth. That's the point of it being exploitation. That wealth wasn't created by the exploitation. It was just stripped from the workers. Without the exploitation, that wealth would still exist. It would just have been in the hands of the workers. And wealth is far more efficiently used when it's held by workers than it is when it's held by the wealthy. The wealthy just hoard their wealth. They just hoard big treasure troves of it. Working people actually spend their money, which invigorates the economy. Socialism does not just mean better welfare. Though under socialism, you'd better believe there will be better welfare. Though ideally, of course, people will be making a lot more from their jobs, so welfare won't be as much of a necessity. I would prefer decommodification of human necessities to welfare. Rather than giving people money, let them have good jobs. And if they can't work, make sure that food and housing are free. I think that'd be a better way of handling things, rather than treating it all as just capital being reinvested. Is hoarding wealth actually a problem economically? Yes, no, it's a huge, yeah, no, it's a massive problem. The Panama Papers and shit, there are literally like tens of trillions of dollars. Like, you think Elon Musk is the wealthiest man in the world. You don't know the name of the wealthiest man in the world, okay? Literally, like, the more money, like the GDP of the United States multiple times over is just sitting in boxes on an island, not literally in boxes, but it's just sitting on an island. That amount of money, if re-entered into the global economy, would usher in an era of prosperity, the likes of which you've never seen before. Like, I'm not joking. I know that sounds cartoonish, like it's a bunch of gold or water being brought back to poor or thirsty people, but like, it is literally, you know, it's not new extra money. This isn't an inflationary issue. That money was already printed. It's already been minted. It already exists. It already, quote unquote, circulates. But trillions, tens of trillions are just being held offshore, illegally, away from taxation, just kept over there. It's just sitting there. You know why nothing is being done about it? Because the people who own that wealth own the politicians. That sounds like a juvenile statement, but it's literally true. Like, anyone who could hoard billions of dollars in an offshore account can keep politicians from looking into it. Obviously. Alki Demos, all you do is whine. Quit whining. It's weak. You're weak. It's not a cheap... If you think it's a cheap populist point to point out that the ultra-wealthy have hoarded an ungodly amount of money offshore where it's being kept illegally from taxation, from the people, if you think that's like cheap, no, it's quite a wealthy populist point, I'll have you know. You can call it whining if you want. I do, and your weakness disgusts me. $4 trillion in U.S. wealth is stashed overseas, much of it in tax havens. So that's just U.S. money, right? Depending on who you look at, like, every article has its own. This is from Reuters, and this is from a decade ago. Super rich hold 32 trillion in offshore havens. Like, it's indescribable the amount of money this is. Like, the amount this represents. This is like the wealth of the earth is being stripped from the planet and is being hoarded in like a banking account somewhere offshore. Like, for no reason. US GDP is less than this. In today's money, it's 23.32 trillion. Back in 2012, when this article was written, our GDP was 16.25. So this is twice the US GDP. Not the US discretionary budget, the US GDP. Is there no way to stop wealth accumulation without taking other people's money? It's not their money, Bright Sea. It's our money. They took it by building rules and walls that benefited them. It's not theirs. It's ours. They're thieves, and we have to take it back. It's illegally held wealth. It wouldn't matter if it was legally held. They made the laws. The top 1% of Americans have taken 50 trillion from the bottom 90%, and that's made the U.S. less secure. It's made it more secure for the wealthy. All right. I feel like we've sufficiently riled people up against the owning class. Very important. Could you give us a hypothetical situation where we retrieve that stolen wealth via bourgeois electoral politics? Tax law. What do you mean? I don't know what legal, like, strategies you would have to engage in to go after illegally held offshore wealth, but it's possible. It's always possible, right? For instance, the Panama Papers, all those documents that leaked, named hundreds of thousands of entities that store their wealth there. Arrest them and tell them to bring the money back. They put it there. It's illegal. They did a crime. If you run a red light, if you break the law, you can be arrested. Is it so ostentatious that they would also be held to that same standard?